Good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here on with you all. My name is Daniel Gutman, and grew up here in Omaha, and went to college out of state and spent about 5 years before law school working on criminal justice reform, specifically in the context of youth justice, kids that are incarcerated, and later working with legislatures on the reform of youth life without parole prison sentences. Kind of worked on that throughout the country, and then went to law school, and now I'm practicing law here in Omaha.
Thanks, Daniel. Shakur?
Well, I thought that you were going to tell me what you did at the Southern Poverty Law Center. You didn't put any details into that.
Yeah, I guess I'll. I'm really hoping that Shakur will be the star of the show. But much of my work before law school focused on, like I said, kids that were incarcerated, and so the focus of my time at Southern Poverty Law Center was working with young people that were housed in adult facilities. And so one of my missions there was to go in and meet with the children that were in adult facilities and think about litigation strategies and policy strategies to challenge the practice of transferring youth into our adult systems. And we can talk kind of more about that as we go on if folks are interested. But that's kind of where my career started, was youth and adult facilities. And through some of those interactions, I met a number of kids that were facing and ultimately sentenced to life without parole. And never could and still can't wrap my head around the fact that our country sentences children to die in prison. And so after meeting with some people in that context, that's when I transitioned my work to focusing exclusively on life without parole sentences imposed on kids.
Good evening, everybody. I am Shakur Abdullah. I, too, am originally here from Omaha. So I grew up in North Omaha at a time very much not dissimilar to the days and times that we live in now. I remember riots and protests and streets burning and just a lot of chaos and turmoil. I'm currently 62 years old, and I'm still just trying to wrap my head around when things are going to change and get different. It was much of that conflict that I was having, identity issues, just police brutality, a lot of other madness going on in society that as a young child in my preteens, I was just trying to figure out. My family originally moved here from Mississippi, attempting to flee the racial terrorism that was going on there just to provide a better life for the family. Ended up here in Omaha with other family members that had moved here during what's called or known as the Great Migration. Blacks from the South to the North, 1910 to 1970. My father ended up working in the packing houses of South Omaha. It was a very honorable profession. At that time in my life, I just didn't think so, didn't really appreciate it. That, along with just the trouble that I was having processing my feelings and conflicts and all that, led me to begin to self-medicate on pretty much every drug I could get my hands on at the time, just to try to cope with my issues and just take the pain away. It didn't work. That activity escalated up to junior high, where I also began selling drugs. That also escalated into junior high school or high school, where that activity just continued. I had pretty quickly surmised that I would never want to work as hard as my father did to probably provide for myself or a family. There were always street corner opportunities available, and that's kind of what I gravitated towards. That all culminated with a very horrible event. Midway the 11th grade, I was involved in a drug deal that went horribly bad. Left one young man dead, another young man nearly dead. 16 years old, I was charged with first-degree murder and shooting with intent to kill, wound, or maim. By the time I turned 17, August 20th, 1975, just a short stay from where we are here to tonight during this discussion, Douglas County Courthouse. For that first-degree murder charge, I was sentenced to death row and an additional 15 to 50 years for that second charge. Spent 2 years on death row. 1977, the state Supreme Court reached a decision in part that the United States Supreme Court did not reach until 2005 in a juvenile death penalty case out of Missouri, Roper versus Simmons. Part of the reason, one of the major mitigating factors to overturn my death sentence was that I was just too young to be on death row. To my knowledge, the youngest person in the state ever to be placed on death row at 17 years old. I had the tremendous fortune, after being taken off of death row, to be placed into general population at the Nebraska State Penitentiary. Met a few guys who really changed my life, turned my life around. One of them had previously been on death row maybe 20, 25 years prior to my arrival. A couple of the other guys were serving life sentences or just big sentences. They were trying to work their way out of prison in a way that they would not return. Then, unlike now, you could leave the penitentiary and go to like a university or trade school just to try to give yourself a better fighting chance or put more tools in your toolbox, if you would, when you got released from prison. That's what these guys were doing. They took me under their wings, really didn't have to, just began to point out to me things that I would probably have to make in terms of decisions and choices. When I got off of death row and was given a life sentence, to me, all I heard was that I was still going to die in prison. So meeting these guys that were actually at the end of a sentence that I had started or the sentence that I was currently doing really was a breakthrough moment for me. These days, I guess they call it re-entry. It was really a moment of clarity for me to understand and know that it was possible to get out of prison, because I had standing in front of me living, breathing examples of individuals that were at the end of the sentence that I was currently doing. So they suggested that I might do my sentence if I could get to the end of it the way that they were doing theirs, or they pointed out plenty other examples of individuals that had come to prison not with homicide cases, but with burglary, robbery cases, or other types of cases, and had just through poor choice after poor choice after poor decision, have just continued to accumulate more time, and some are never ever going to get out of prison. The United States Supreme Court, starting with that 2005 death penalty case, juvenile death penalty case out of Missouri, Roper versus Simmons, there were 3 other subsequent decisions that cited back to that allowed me to go back to court to get resentenced in 2015, November 30th. Came back to Douglas County District Court. I was resentenced to 65 to 82 years. I was doing the math in my head. I realized that the judge had just resentenced me to not parole or to get released from prison under any type of supervision. He had just resentenced me to discharge my sentence. This resentencing hearing was kind of lengthy and involved, and there were a lot of different elements to it. But I think the judge was convinced, based on his sentence, that I was ready to get out of prison and not get out on parole. 65 to 82 years turned out to be 55 days to the date that I had got arrested 41 years earlier. January 24th of 2016, I was able to walk out of the Omaha Correctional Center for the first time after serving 41 years. There were a lot of thoughts that was swirling around my head at the time. The primary one was how I would never ever step voluntarily back in anybody's jail or prison. I knew I had left friends behind and I wanted to reach back and help. I just thought that I would never have to go back in a jail or prison to do that. Look, I have to take responsibility, be accountable, be culpable for the acts and decisions that I made, even at 16 years old. I have to accept my part in those choices and decisions that ended with, unfortunately, the death of one young man and the severe injury to another young man. I have to accept that, be responsible and accountable for that. It is something that I will never, ever be able to walk back. I will forever be remorseful and regret that that ever happened. So after I got out of prison, probably 6 months after that, I got my first job as an adult. Began working at Reconnecting as a reentry specialist. Actually went there as a client and ended up with a job offer. That lasted for about 3 years. Had numerous promotions there. That job actually began putting me back in contact with individuals that I had just left. Reconnecting is a reentry initiative located here in Omaha, run by LaVon Stennis-Williams. She is the executive director there. Made the choice to hire me. It was probably something that I didn't understand or see the full magnitude of, but I think she did. So like I say, that lasted 3 years. I got hired where I am currently working now as a restorative justice trainer and facilitator with the Community Justice Center, actually located in Lincoln, Nebraska, but we have an office here in Omaha. That agency, the CJC, is its founder is a former, he won't mind me saying crackhead, but he's a former crackhead who turned his life around after committing 5 robberies on a drug-induced bender down in Lincoln. On his way out of prison, he learned some things that he now teaches in these restorative justice workshops that we do, 8 hours long. We service the largest county jail in the state, Douglas County, also Lancaster County Jail. Doing this workshop, it's really made up of 3 components: restorative justice, victim impact, and emotional hygiene. We also serve every probation district in the state except Douglas County. There are 12 of them. We do all 11 of them. We also provide services to all 10 prisons throughout the state. All of them. There are 10. We provide services to all of them. Jim Jones learned some things on his way out of prison that he has been able to take back up into prison and kind of do what was done for him. That's certainly what I am attempting to do these days, is those men that I told you that I met initially after getting off of death row. All I'm trying to do now is to pay it forward or to give back, to do what was done for me. Those gentlemen turned my life around. They really became like surrogate fathers, uncles, brothers, and very good friends. They gave me the opportunity to do what I'm doing now, to be a face for the faceless, a voice for the voiceless, to sow the same seeds of hope in individuals that they sowed in me. So that is what I am doing now as a restorative justice trainer. Probably the best thing that could have happened to me since getting out of prison. So with that, I will conclude my intro.
Thank you. Thank you, Shakur. I have one just very basic kind of thing. I know from a theological standpoint, the word justice is kind of a loaded word, and it's so easy for us to fall into a trap of thinking that justice is all about God smiting my enemies and making things right for me. But really, in the Bible, it's the justice of God is all about, I guess maybe the best way to say it is setting things right. God talks about, in the Bible, talks about doing justice, that we are to do justice, that we are to do good and seek justice, correct oppression. Always wrapped up in God's justice are phrases like, caring for the orphan and widow and visiting the prisoner, that kind of thing. Those are all always in the same places that the Bible talks about justice. Does that lead us towards what you mean by restorative justice? And if not, can you talk about what you mean by restorative justice?
Okay, so restorative justice has actually been around for a while. It's actually beginning to gain traction. So the current system that all of us are familiar with is the retributive system. It is punishment-based. It is generally only about that. I can tell you from my own experience that there is not a lot of, I don't like to use the word rehabilitation. I think it's sends the wrong connotation in terms of what we are talking about. At the CJC, we talk about in terms of trying to make people habilitated as opposed to rehabilitated. Rehabilitation kind of gives the idea that, somebody commits a crime, they go to jail, they go into prison, they will get rehabilitated, which for me kind of suggests that you would put the person back at the point in which they came in. And most people go to jail or prison pretty messed up. So if it is just an attempt to put people back at their status quo of entry, it probably explains why the recidivism rate is so high in the United States, at like the mid 70 percentile. So within a 3-year period, 7 out of 10 people are returning to prison. So to me, that is not a very good calling card for rehabilitation, if that's what you are wanting to call it. So when we talk about restorative justice, it's talked about from a different aspect. Restorative justice asks a 2-part question. What harm was done and what needs to be done to repair that harm. It recognizes the fact that harm occurs between people, human relationships. You go down to any courthouse and you always hear the state of Nebraska versus the person. Very few of the harms that are committed are actually committed against the state. So the initial general direction or thrust of the current system begins to head off in the wrong way. That's why you have such a high victim or survivor satisfaction, because the plea bargain rate is like 98%, 98.9% or 99% of all cases in the United States are plea bargain. Again, it's not that the state has been harmed. It's not a treason case, not an espionage case, not even, for the most part, some of these drug kingpin laws that have been enacted that go against the state, where the death penalty may be applied to those types of offenses. No, it is some person has harmed or injured another person, but the harmed person generally gets relegated to the sideline. Their name doesn't even end up on the masthead of the case. It's buried in the content of the case. So restorative justice is a tool that can be used along with the current system to just yield a better result. There are many other countries around the world that are utilizing restorative justice practices. And for restorative justice to really be that, it has a couple components or elements. So there are three stakeholders in restorative justice. It is a victim-centered approach because the victim is the one that suffers the most harm, but also the one that causes the harm is a stakeholder, and then also the community is a stakeholder. Those stakeholders' needs must be met all together in order for it to really truly be a restorative justice process. At its apex, restorative justice is a process that meets the needs of all three stakeholders in an attempt to bring about some healing, repair, or restoration. Again, when you look at many other countries around the world, if the litmus test to whether or not your penal system is working, I think it has to turn on how many people you have coming back into the system. Well, the United States is number one in a lot of things, and locking people up, they are also number one. 5% of the world's population exist here in the United States, but 25% of everybody locked up anywhere are locked up here in the United States. 2.3 million people in confinement facilities alone, another 7 million on some form of supervised release, whether that be parole, probation, all of these other forms of diversion programs and other things that keep you from going to prison but are still supervised. So the most highly incarcerated spot anywhere exists here in America. There has been all of these different wars that have been talked about, the war on drugs and all of this. For the last 40 years, the only thing that it has done is, like I say, created the highest incarcerated population in the history of the world and anywhere in the world. Restorative justice, it works in a way that it brings all of the stakeholders together the victim survivor satisfaction is much higher because they are part of the process. Everybody has an opportunity to feel as though they are part of an integrated unit, unlike the retributive system, for the most part, is generally all adversarial, the state against the person that committed the harm. Look, I don't know about anybody else, but I don't know any perfect people. We all make mistakes. We all fall short of the measure or mark in terms of things that we are striving for. But that doesn't make up the totality or the sum total of who we are. I am not just the person who went to prison at 17 years old. I don't know anybody who would want to be known or forever remembered for the worst mistake or worst day of their life that they have ever had. So restorative justice, one component of it for some, I talked about the stakeholders' needs getting met. For many stakeholders, one of the things that they may have as a need is forgiveness. I have witnessed extraordinary instances of victims being able to forgive the person that caused them harm. And I'm not talking about just robbery cases or things getting stolen. I'm talking about homicide cases where you have the victim who has forgiven the person who killed their niece or daughter, son, father, just for their own healing, to be able to move on. They have been able to not forget. And the forgiveness is not for the person that causes the harm, it's for themselves. But all of the stakeholders have to find some measure of healing in order to move on. And that is ultimately what restorative justice is about. Again, it is not purely punishment based or driven. It is purely driven by trying to repair, restore the harm that has been done. And like I say, that's to human relationships. It's not, like I say, generally the state. I can't say during the 41 years that I spent incarcerated that I met anybody that had actually committed an offense against the state. But again, when you look at the legal paperwork, that's who is at the top of that masthead. Thanks,
that was really helpful. I've got a question for both of you guys. Is there anything, or two or three things in the movie, the book, that really resonated with your experiences, that really hit home, or that you wished had been done differently because it didn't resonate with your experiences?
You want me to go? Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Brian Stevenson talks about generally, and it was addressed in the movie a little bit, is the power of narrative. And one of the things that you said, Keith, is you talked about this theological approach of identifying oppression and meeting with the prisoner. And, I think we've reached a point where not only do we need to meet with the prisoner, but we need to ask why the person's in prison, because we have so many people in prison. And one of the things about the movie and again, about Brian Stevenson generally in this frame of narrative is, when I moved to Alabama and I would go into these adult jails and meet with children, it's one of the ways that society has normalized that process and has been so complicit in mass incarceration is the way that the narrative plays out. Children become juveniles. People become felons or offenders. isolation becomes protective custody. A jail cell is not defined as a cage, which it is, but more of a protective place. I mean, those are all narrative structures that we've embodied in our normal vocabulary that normalizes the mass warehousing of human beings. And I've always thought that that's a big point of what Bryan Stevenson is talking about and is challenging us to do. I think one other point in terms of this narrative is, Shakur and I didn't even compare notes about what we were talking about, but we kind of wrote down the same things as, from a legal perspective, the United States prides itself on having a legal system that is adversarial. And one of the hallmarks of an adversarial system is a case caption. And what I mean by that is Brown versus the Board of Education, Graham v. Florida, somebody versus somebody else. And what that caption is doing is it's signifying the adversaries. It's one party versus another party. Now, just a real slight diversion here. There's a legal principle that says that an entity can only act through its employees. And that makes sense, right? I can't go shake Walmart's hand. If I'm going to sue Walmart, Daniel Gutman versus Walmart, I'm not suing Walmart, I'm suing its employees, because Walmart can only act through people. And the same is true in a criminal case. A criminal case is captioned the state of Nebraska versus the condemned person. And what's happening there is the state of Nebraska can only act through its people. So what that caption really means is not the state of Nebraska versus the condemned person, but it means Daniel Gutman versus the condemned person. And it means Shakur Abdullah versus the condemned person. And Keith Winton versus the condemned person, because the state can only act through people. And so they borrow our names to go out and do things like pursue the death penalty. They borrow our names to go out and incarcerate people for long periods of time. And so when you see that case caption, the state of Nebraska, you should be internalizing it as that's you, that's us. And I think an important component for me, and one thing I've thought about since Just Mercy is, if the state's going to be using our name to do those things, we need to hold those people accountable. And we need to be aware of what the state is doing in our name, how they're using our name to pursue their version of justice. And if we don't like it, we need to do something about it. And so those are some kind of big themes from the movie. Again, on a more personal note, I thought it was striking. I also visited children that were in facilities, and there was a lot of clips of Bryan going in, and a lot of those stories I would hear too of just horrific abuse and sexual abuse at the hands of adults and the people in charge. And it really is a horrific system, and it's one that we're oftentimes blinded to.
Just to kind of continue on that thing. So, the Just Mercy film is a death penalty film. 166 people have been exonerated from death row since executions have resumed in the United States since 1976. What that means is even Walter McMillan could have been another victim of the state via execution had he not made it off of death row. Bryan Stevenson frames the question around the death penalty, which most people kind of simply say, well, does the person deserve to be on death row? Did they do something so horrendous that they need to be killed. He poses the question this way: does the state have the right to kill? Not whether or not does the person deserve to die. It puts the perspective of the question a different way, much like what Daniel just described. It gives you the lens of understanding that you are a part of the process, and many people feel that the state should not kill in their name, and that is ultimately what happens in a death penalty case. When you look at the death penalty as a whole, it is supposedly a deterrent. Death penalty has been imposed even here in Nebraska for a very, very long time. They began hanging people in the state of Nebraska, eventually worked their way to the electric chair, and now lethal injection. The thing about the death penalty is this: even with the 166 people that have been exonerated, 1 out of every 9 people on death row is innocent. So if you take that into the totality of the circumstance of the 1,518 people that have been executed in the United States since 1976, 1 in 9 of those were innocent. There is no recall. There is no redo with that penalty. Once it is done, there is no fixing it. There is a case in Nebraska, 1887. The state executed a guy by the name of Jackson Marion in Beatrice. He was accused of killing his best friend, got tried 3 times until he was eventually given the death penalty. There was all these doubts about whether or not he had actually murdered his friend. About a year later, somebody left Beatrice, went to Kansas, under the suspicion that Jackson Marion hadn't killed anybody. He actually found the guy that Jackson Marion was put to death for killing and brought him back to Beatrice. Governor Bob Kerrey posthumously pardoned Jackson Marion 100 years later, 1997. So the death penalty is fraught with all of these problems. And like I say, there's no fixing that.
Shakur, let me, that leads into a quote that you gave me. It's from the Marshall Report, The Next to Die, from the introduction by Gabriel Dance, right? It's, the quote is, "Looking back, we know quite a bit about who has been put to death in the United States. We know that the last person to be executed was Walter Barton, who died 1 month and 9 days ago by lethal injection in Missouri. We have records that show he was the 1,518th person to have been executed since 1976. In fact, since executions resumed that year following a 4-year suspension imposed by the Supreme Court, we know many specifics, including race, age, sex, and other information about those who have paid the ultimate price in our criminal justice system."
So, I mean, the death penalty is not deterring anything. And I think the individuals that have a stake in the process have to be willing, I think, to take a stand. I mean, look, the days and times that we live in now have been brought about, again, by things that have been going on my entire life. I don't know if if the nation is in a watershed moment where things are going to change for the better, or some other old 62-year-old guy, 62 years from now will be saying what I'm saying. I hope not. But, you know, I think people really have to get involved in the process. Look, these officials are elected officials. The death penalty begins to be one of those polarizing issues that can generally make or break somebody's campaign. I remember Michael Dukakis running for president against not the George Bush that most of us remember, but his father. Mm-hmm. They were in a debate, and Michael Dukakis was asked a question. If someone were to rape and murder Kitty, his wife, Kitty Dukakis, would you then be in favor of having the death penalty imposed? Michael Dukakis stood on his principle, and he said, I have always been against the death penalty. I am against the death penalty. Even under those circumstances, I would still be against the death penalty. Even he later goes on to admit that making that statement probably was the cause of him losing that presidential run, because he was seen as being soft on crime. And Bush wasn't. So the death penalty is always going to be fraught and caught up in the politics of our time. These days are no different. But, you know, every state in the United States doesn't have the death penalty.
Daniel, did you have any sort of eye-opening moment like we saw in the movie for Brian, where something particular that you saw or experienced made you, you know, leave your safe middle-class life in Omaha and go to Alabama? What spurred you on to do that?
Yeah, one of the first kind of campaigns that I got involved in, and many people on this call will probably remember this. In 2000, maybe it was 2001, a national campaign came to Nebraska and started an initiative process to write into our state constitution that same-sex marriage was not permissible. Now, of course, it wasn't permissible anyway, but they wanted to take this extra step of kind of enshrining it into our state constitution. And I was a freshman in high school then, and I became very passionate about that issue and opposing that initiative. And it exposed for me a lot of things. I mean, the positive of meeting other people that were passionate about issues and that kind of wanted to fight for social justice. It also exposed to me the vitriol that of our society at that time. I remember I used to go door to door and talk to people, and I remember now just how the horrible things that people would say in response to a conversation about equal rights for people. And that to me was a big catalyst of thinking about structural reform. I mean, if you think about it, there's a reason why there was a national campaign at that time that was traveling around the country to write into state constitutions that same-sex marriages were impermissible when they were already impermissible by law, right? The reason behind that is because, you know, they wanted to bake into the system this notion of inequality. And so when we hear about structural inequality now and structural racism, when you hear those terms, a lot of times what people are referring to is this notion of normalizing inequality, not only in hate speech, but also in our laws. I mean, that law, which passed overwhelmingly, took that additional step of writing into our Constitution, gay people, this is not a state for gay and lesbians. And if you want to get married, you're not welcome here. And we as a state overwhelmingly supported that position. And for a long time, it was the law of the land, right? And so that kind of got me thinking about these structural issues. And after I went to college, I was able to kind of focus that energy more so on this issue of criminal justice.
Thanks. That actually leads into my last question, and we'll sort of open up the floor. It seems to me that it's an easy trap for us to fall into, sitting here to demonize the people of the South and to demonize the situation there, and to make the bad guy be the South and on all the racism that they have there. And to blind ourselves to the implicit and explicit racism that we have everywhere here, in our state and in our city. I mean, from the Will Brown lynching, 100 years ago to the, some of the most extreme redlining in the country that in the mid 1900s that defines our neighborhoods even today.
I'll tell a quick story.
Okay. To James Scurlock's death just a few weeks ago, we need to heed that call to remove the log from our own eye before we think that comfortably this all happens mostly in the South. I think you have a response to any of that?
Keith, I just have a quick story on that. That got me thinking. I remember when I first started in Alabama, one of the initiatives that I worked on was dealt with youth detention. And this practice that we have in this country that happens every day, where children that are accused of crimes are often held in youth facilities. And when I say youth facilities, please don't glorify that in your mind. I mean, they're cages where we keep kids. And we take them away from their family, and we take them away from their school setting, and we place them in these facilities, these warehouses, where they wait often for months. And not surprisingly, kids that look like me do not go to youth detention facilities. Oftentimes when the police bring a child down, one person can make a decision whether you go home or you stay. And most of the time, the people that they choose to stay are Black and brown children. And so when I moved down to Alabama, one of our projects was to work on Birmingham, Alabama's youth detention facility. And at the time that I got there, there was about 100 boys in the facility and about 10 girls. And almost all of them were Black or brown children. And it was known as a national crisis, Birmingham. And people looked at Birmingham as a national crisis. They have 110 kids in the facility at any given day. Those are children that are taken out of their home, taken away from their school. And so I always viewed Birmingham's facility through that lens. And I remember this one time I came back home over winter. I came back to Omaha, and it was Christmas Eve. And I called somebody that was able to give me a tour of the Douglas County youth facility here, which is about 2 blocks from my house now. And I went into the facility, and remember, I've got this Birmingham national emergency in my head. And I said, how many kids do you have in here? And they said that they had 135 boys and 30 girls locked in cells on Christmas Eve in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, remember, I said Birmingham was kind of the poster child of being the national emergency with about 115 kids. And here I am going to Omaha, which is about the same size as Birmingham, and they've got on average 40 to 50 more kids in there a day. And I've always thought about that as a reminder that, I mean, that's just one very small example, that these problems are not in Alabama only. I mean, we have these problems here. They are very profound. I'm sitting next to a gentleman who was put on death row, who was told as a child he was irredeemable and would never get away, and that they were going to execute. I mean, that didn't happen in Alabama. That happened right here. And thankfully, they didn't go through with that. But I mean, I think that's a critical point, Keith, which is we cannot think of that as a Southern problem or some other problem. I mean, that is happening right here. Sorry to take up.
Just a quick mention of something else that resonated with me. Look, I will never ever watch Just Mercy again, but I encourage anybody that hasn't watched it to do so. It is a very powerful, eye-opening piece of cinema that is telling the truth that will help to remove the veil off of some people's eyes that believe that because things don't happen to them, it's not a concern. But, you know, because things may not happen to you is what has protests going on around the world now based on an incident that happened about a month ago in Minnesota. That is something that resonated with people's humanity. Batson versus Kentucky, 1986 Supreme Court case. That was an attempt to try to create a jury of your peers when you have a trial. Clever prosecutors have found ways to get around the ruling in Batson. So on any given day, you can go here to Douglas County and you will not see juries of individuals here. You will end up seeing juries like what I had when I went to trial, all white jury. You know, look, it's hard to shake the dust off when you get it on you. It's a metaphor just to say that we all bring our opinions, biases, prejudices, whether they are implicit or unconscious, into everything that we do. It may not be something that you may be aware of, but the fact that you still have today juries that are the total opposite of what the defendant looks like continues to be a problem. It makes it far more easier, I believe, oftentimes for people to convict somebody that doesn't look like their son, their daughter, or somebody that they know. The young man who was killed in Colorado, McLean, about a year ago, they are showing the video of what led up to that. He was in the store with a mask on. You know, I walk into stores these days and even the police have masks on. He was in a store with a mask on, purchasing items. Somebody thought that that was suspicious. They called the cops. There's a guy with a mask in the store buying things, but he's black. The cops encounter him and, you know, unfortunately things escalated. He was choked, injected with ketamine, and later died. But these types of encounters with white cops and people of color oftentimes turn very violent and oftentimes deadly just because some of these isms that we have within us kick in. And like I say, sometimes racism is like cancer. You may go to the doctor for a checkup feeling the best that you have ever felt in your life. And the doctor comes back and says, well, we ran these battery tests on you. And, you know, despite your good feeling, you have cancer. And that's kind of the way that racism operates oftentimes. There are those that know, but then there are those that don't know. And that may even be more pernicious and deadly than the overt aspect of it. Because oftentimes silence means consent, and it allows a lot of things to continue to go on.
Mm-hmm.
We've got one question from Renee. You guys can see it there in the chat. I think, as I understand her question, it's basically, what is the hope for restorative justice to be able to change our current penal system when it's trying to operate, sort of inside the current penal system? How have you found success, and what is the hope for more success?
Okay, so I guess ultimately for me, my pie in the sky goal would be a world without prisons. So much like the verbal declaration that we hear in certain parts of the country now to defund the police, that sounds absolutely crazy to somebody that has never been on the bad end of an encounter with the police. So for many people, the motto of to serve and protect, that is all that they have ever received in their life. But there are others that serve and protect turns into surveil and punishment. So the lens in which we see our encounters are oftentimes different. I think restorative justice ultimately could begin to do away with prisons, or at least repurpose them in a way that you get better results than what you are getting now. Nebraska, depending on what month it is, has the second or first overpopulated prison in the country. It's either Nebraska or Alabama. It just depends on where the numbers are that month. So Nebraska's solution to its overpopulation is to build more prisons. If you follow the field of dreams philosophy, if you build it, they will come. If you build another prison, you will fill it. So that obviously isn't working. Restorative justice, when done correctly, and like I say, there are a lot of evidence-based statistics to back the viability of restorative justice. You even have many jurisdictions around the United States now that first scoffed at it and said that this is nonsense. We got to lock people up. We need to send people to jail and prison. But why should somebody that has a drug habit end up in prison and not a treatment facility? Taxpayers' dollars are oftentimes wasted on the current process of incarceration rather than doing things to keep people out of the system, get them treatment so that they do not recidivate. The program that we do, the workshop that we do at the CJC, we have a lot of evidence-based data to show that recidivism can be reduced with the right approach. So the 8-hour workshop that we do, like I say, is made up of 3 components. It is restorative justice, it is victim impact, and what any CJC trainer will tell you, the most valuable thing that we have to extend to our clients is the emotional hygiene part of those workshops. It is the part that a client can get that allows them to understand how to process themselves to a good choice, a good decision every time by processing many of those feelings that we oftentimes are told that we shouldn't have or shouldn't deal with. Toxic masculinity is another way of looking at it. the results that we get, the state of Nebraska has about a 32% recidivism rate. Over the nearly 20 years that we have been doing this workshop at the CJC, almost served 10,000 people. Our recidivism rate for all of the participants that have gone through our workshop cuts the state's recidivism in half, is right at like 18 or 19%. So, you know, it's not that everybody that takes our workshop is not going back to prison, but again, our statistics show that we have something that even reduces the recidivism rate that the state has. Now, you know, that's going to meet the needs of all of the stakeholders, the victim, the offender, and the community. If you don't have people recidivating, that makes the community safer. It's also going to save tax dollars because you aren't having to provide maintenance for them while confined somewhere.
Hey, a couple of questions, maybe they kind of go together. The first one, CJC must work in partnership with prosecutors' offices and defense counsels, it sounds like. And are sort of along with that, I think, what are the dangers that come with that when you said 97% or more of the cases are resolved with plea agreements? Does that mean that, you know, prosecution didn't really have to prove guilt, and what are the implications of that?
Okay, well, what is the plea bargain? The plea bargain is a tool used by the prosecution basically to keep the machine running. If you look at your constitutional right to a speedy trial, if everybody decided that no matter what, I got caught in the act, you got me on film, whatever, I'm going to trial. If everybody decided that they were going to trial, the system would immediately come to a halt because you couldn't get all of those cases into court in time. So the plea bargain, and this is why the rate is so high, 99%, it is used it is used for the judicial economy in the sense that we got to get all of these cases through the system. So we need to make these deals. And again, that's why many of the victims end up dissatisfied because they may have wanted the offender to get more time, and the plea has already been made. They had no say-so in it. Or they may just wanted restitution. Well, I didn't really want them to go to jail. All I need is just some restitution. Just pay me for the harm that was. Well, no, we're not going to do that. We have already played the case out, and they are going to prison. So the plea bargain is really a arbitrary tool that is used to keep the machine running. And like I say, it doesn't ultimately provide complete or partial satisfaction to the victim because they aren't involved in the process. So plea bargains, at least in my mind, in my experience, even though I wasn't allowed to plead in my case, wanted to, attempted to, the judge said, no, not going to let this be played out. We are going to trial. But that's how the plea bargain is used. It's used as a threat. Look, you have all of these cases. You have 3 cases pending. I'm going to offer you a deal. I will give you a 3-year sentence or a 5-year sentence, and we won't prosecute you on the other 2 cases. So again, somebody got harmed in those other 2 cases, but the victims get no satisfaction out of it because the cases get pled away. To me, it is not ultimately about justice. It is ultimately about keeping the machine running and building up a rate of convictions. oh, well, this case is done. We done planned it out. Let's get the next one in. So it really doesn't have a lot to do with justice in my mind. It really is a tool that gets in the way of any true restoration or repair for ultimately anybody involved.
A couple quick points on that too, Keith, just building off on what Shakur said. That's an excellent question about the plea bargaining. It's a huge problem, and I know that there's, I think Shakur said there's some public defenders, maybe even on this chat, who could probably speak far more eloquently than me on this point. But remember too that we have people sitting in jails. We impose cash bail on people that they can't afford, where we literally tell them that you need to buy your freedom. And if you're too poor to buy your freedom, well, that's really too bad. You're going to sit in this cell. And the effect that has is, of course, people have families at home, they have jobs, they have a life. And when they're being told you're too poor to afford your freedom, well, the next option is, but maybe you can walk home if you plead guilty right now. And so it puts a lot of people in a really impossible position of saying, well, I can't buy my freedom through bail. And so what I need to do is accept a plea offer so I can get home to my kids. And that's a huge factor. Another quick point, I did a 2-year clerkship with a judge in federal court. And so he heard mainly federal drug crimes. The mandatory minimum sentences for drug crimes are outrageous. Lots of people spending an enormous amount of time in federal prisons because of drugs. Now, one quick anecdote, I was working for a federal trial court judge, and that, of course, implies that there are trials. And he heard criminal cases. During the 2 years that I was there was hundreds, if not thousands, of criminal cases, and there was 2 trials, 2. And one of the reasons for that is there's sentencing guidelines that spit out huge numbers for how much drugs you have and for other factors. And so if you're caught with drugs and you have a prior offense, that's more time. And if you were caught with a gun with the drugs, that's more time. Well, another factor that they consider that gives you more time is if you go to trial. You're actually punished through the federal sentencing guidelines if you go to trial as opposed to taking a plea. So what public defenders have to tell their clients is, you can take this plea and sit in prison for 10 years, but if you're found guilty, or you can go to trial, but if you're found guilty, you're going to get that 10 years and you're going to get an extra 2 years or whatever it is. You're going to get punished for exercising your constitutional right to go to trial. It's a strike against them. And the last thing, there was another question that talked about prosecutors and defense counsel need to act more fairly. And I agree with that. But even the most fair arbiter of justice is not going to do much in this system. You can be very fair in this system, but you've got to remember the system is very unfair. So even if you operate fairly in this unfair system, we're still going to have a lot of these same problems. I mean, I think that we need to be thinking bigger about changing the system. Why is it that we have so many plea deals? Why is it that if we over-police certain communities, and then when they're convicted, when the people are convicted of a felony, there's restrictions on their voting. They can't serve on juries, like Shakur said. The 2 criminal trials that I witnessed when I was with the judge, it was all white juries, all white all the time. And that was the norm. And part of it is because of our demographics of our state, but part of it is because we over-police certain communities, and once they are caught with a felony or plead to a felony, they can no longer serve on a jury. So we need to be thinking about just simply acting fairly within the system isn't going to get us very far. I think we need to talk about changing the system itself.
Right. Just another quick mention, going back to Batson versus Kentucky, that case was supposed to kind of nullify the all-white jury. but it still happens. And the reason why a prosecutor doesn't want people of color on a jury is this presupposed disposition that they aren't going to be tough on crime, that they would be willing to let somebody go. Mm-hmm. Well, you know, that the legal term for that is jury nullification. So they don't want that to happen, it seems. So they will arbitrarily, through their strikes, keep certain people off of the jury. So, you know, but just to kind of flash back to 1992, the LA riots, the reason why those riots occurred was because of jury nullification. Mm-hmm. Those 4 cops, you know, they talk about a picture being worth 1,000 words. That video of Rodney King being brutally beat down in the street by those cops was speaking more than 1,000 words. But that video was not enough for an all-white jury. And once that case got moved out of LA County to Simi Valley before an all-white jury, that video was not evidence enough of any wrongdoing by the cop. Rodney King was arrested for resisting arrest. At no time in that video can he be seen resisting a taser, resisting a boot, resisting a billy club. But those jurors, ultimately what is called jury nullification. Regardless of the evidence, we are not going to find this person guilty, or these people in that particular instance. So they had to be tried again in federal court, just to make sure that LA did not go up again. Mm-hmm. So that is the reason why prosecutors eliminate people of color off of these juries. And like I say, it's nothing new. It continues to go on. Mm-hmm.
Someone asks if people who are sent to prison for drug possession receive adequate treatment while they're in prison.
It depends on who you are asking and what jurisdictions you are in. Some states do a much better job. There is some treatment available here in Nebraska, but again, I will just simply say this, not to cast any aspersions to anybody. The state's recidivism rate reflects the level of programming that they provide. So that recidivism rate is still pretty high. So I would think that there has to be some question of what programming is being offered, how adequate it is. I know in many instances you have a waiting list where individuals can't get treatment because programs are so full or so backed up.
Daniel, I'll let you answer that next question. Do you see it there?
Yeah, it's from my cousin, and he might be putting me on the spot here, fairly so. And I don't know if he's talking about private sector firms, meaning law firms. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that I can't speak to firms generally, you know, in terms of law firms. I don't think that law firms are thinking largely enough about these issues. I think law firms can grasp their heads around individual cases of people needing direct assistance, but are more hesitant to do the systemic reforms that are needed. And I think one of the reasons for that is because when you talk about systemic reforms, oftentimes you're talking about your friends. When we talk about systemic reform in Nebraska, we're talking about people that, you know, some people at least, that you may go to dinner with. And, you know, it's a harder conversation. And I don't know if firms generally are ready to take that jump. Now that said, I know that there are firms, including mine here, that do pro bono work and allow me to work on this stuff too, but I can't speak kind of more generally than that.
So I have noticed, because my husband brings home a bunch of junk from the Bar Association, that in general, there is an interest in getting people to do pro bono work. But one of the things I wonder about is the intensity of some of these cases and the number of hours.
Yeah.
It's say, oh, I'll help somebody for an hour or two on a rental thing, and it's a whole other for what could be a multi-decade situation. And does that impact things?
That is 100% right. I mean, some of these structural type cases take an enormous amount of time. You're working on an uphill battle because remember, the same people that built some of these structures are also our judges. And just to be very frank, when we talk about some of the federal judges on the 8th Circuit here, they're a lot of the same people, and it's hard to get them to understand that. So it's a huge time commitment and not always the results that we want. And that's why I think also we need to think beyond litigation. We need to be thinking beyond, you don't have to be a lawyer to engage in this kind of work. And in fact, there's a lot of people that maybe rightfully say lawyers aren't the right ones to be tackling this. It kind of takes all of us in different roles.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Here's a question, Shakur. If you could arrange an hour meeting with Director Frakes and Governor Ricketts, what would you say to convince them that we don't need a new $200 million prison?
Well, I think first people need to be open-minded enough to know that the current practice of building prisons isn't working. Everybody in prison doesn't need to be there. I'm not convinced that there isn't adequate space prison-wise in the state already to manage the population. Look, when I first went to prison in 1975, the nation's prison population was right at maybe 350,000. Now it is at 2.3 million. That comes at a tremendous tax dollar cost. And I think anybody that's talking about still wanting to build prisons is looking at the problem from the wrong way. You can't build your way out of it. The only thing that keeps people out of prison is thinking differently than the way that they went in. There needs to be more attention put on cognitive programming that helps people reshape their thinking to get a different outcome and decision than the ones that continually send them to prison. For many of them, that's going to be a treatment of some kind. So my hour with the governor and the director would tend to talk along those lines, but I am not convinced that the only solution that they think is appropriate is to build a new prison. Look, you won't be able to build your way out of this situation. Like I say, if the true test to whatever it is you are doing in corrections is how many people are returning, then I think your effort has to be more concentrated on programming that helps you keep people out of jail and prison than just simply building another one to put more people in.
Thanks. Well, maybe we'll take 2 more questions. If you're like on a tablet and can't easily get to the chat, you can wave, and Marissa's on the lookout for you, and she'll let you know you can ask your question out loud.
And while we wait for questions, and Shakur, you might be able to correct me on this, but if for the folks that were interested in restorative justice, you should also look at what happened after the Rwandan genocide. And yeah, truth and reconciliation. And, you know, we think that the U.S. Comes up with the best systems, and we don't like to look around the world for other examples. But I'd encourage those that are interested in restorative justice generally to look at what happened after the Rwandan genocide and how they incorporated principles of restorative justice there.
Since you bring that up, that is something that the trainers at the CJC have been discussing. Is is the nation at a moment in history where truth and reconciliation commissions are necessary? Just to move on. What's going on now, just in terms of the social issues, again, is not anything new. The thing about systemic racism is that it affects everybody. Sometimes people think, well, it's only the one that is oppressed or subjugated that suffers the brunt of racism. No, racism is a disease. It affects everybody. There was a pathology brought here to these shores from Europe. When you examine the Bill of Rights, at least for me, it tells you all you need to really know about the psyche of the founding fathers and the people that came here. They were traumatized in parts of Europe. Some were branded rejects and exiled to America and Australia and other places. You got to leave here. They had trouble in Europe, traumatized by their experiences. The one thing that I have learned through restorative justice is that hurt people hurt people. So you had a lot of hurt people who came here to America, who were dissatisfied with their cousins back in Europe and rose up, had a revolution, took this land from the indigenous people, and maybe not initially, but as time went on, began to unleash their own form of trauma on people. So, when we talk about resolving many of the issues that exist today, we have to go back at least that far. Mm-hmm. We can't start just 50 years ago. We have to start where the pathology started. And like I say, the pathology was brought here to these shores, branded into institutions, and, look at where we are today. Yes. Oh, anyway, I guess the point I was making about the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is that when you look at South Africa and Rwanda and many other places, it provides a very good model for, truth telling. Those Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, unlike many of the trials at the end of World War II, the Nuremberg trials and all that, where many of these individuals that had committed all of these atrocities during World War II were put on trial, taken out back, shot, or hung. What happened in the Truth and Reconciliation commissions was, in order for the country as a whole to heal, the truth had to be told. People needed to be held accountable, culpable for some of the atrocities that they did, and for the good of the country. They weren't taken out back and hung and shot. They were let go. They were still allowed to live in society with everybody else. And, in this country, we just have very different views of what the truth is, what the reality is. And I think the days and times that we are living in now, some of that the veil is beginning to be lifted to some extent, but we still have to see what comes of it.
Thanks. Well, it's 9 p.m. We should be respectful of your time. I can't thank you guys enough for joining this discussion with us tonight and letting us hear your stories and answering our questions. It's just been remarkable. Thanks.
Well, one final note, Shakur and I had the privilege of traveling to Alabama together to go see Brian Stevenson's Legacy Museum.
National Memorial for Peace and Justice.
And once things calm down and it's safe to do so, I really, really encourage everyone to try and get down there if you can. It should be a required experience of every American. I really believe that. Well,
we'll be calling you and see if we can commission you to lead us on a trip.
Yeah, Shakur would be great at that.
Well, maybe I have one last question, and then I'll close in a prayer. But surely one of the top questions still remaining unspoken on all of our minds is what can we do?
Well, there's an election coming up. That's a pretty good start. I mean, look, these are elected officials. Again, I just I hear the call for defunding the police in my head, along with many of the other suggestions that is going on in society. And again, I have heard many politicians say, well, that's a no starter. We ain't defunding no police. Minnesota has taken the steps to do that. I think under abnormal circumstances, you can't rely on the same resolution to try to solve things. So you have to be bold. You have to do things that maybe wouldn't ordinarily be done. But my suggestion to anybody, when you talk about defunding the police, again, it just depends on your experience. Somebody that pays taxes to provide for the police has no interest in paying money for their own subjugation and possibly being choked to death on the street. So for them, defunding the police makes all the sense in the world. So my suggestion would be, we need to open our minds up a little more, educate ourselves a little more, understand that some of these conversations are going to be uncomfortable, but sometimes the truth is uncomfortable. And you have to be willing to do that. But like I say, any of these elected officials that are not ultimately serving your interests, I don't see why you feel compelled to vote for any of them.
I would say three quick things. One, an important thing for me, and it may or may not for you guys, be just be conscious of the vocab. I mean, I'm always conscious of the vocabulary I use for people that are incarcerated, mainly because I don't want to normalize in my own head the way that we warehouse people. Another one is identify what works for you. Some people don't want to go out in the streets and they don't want to post on Facebook, but they're willing to give money. As somebody that has worked in nonprofits, that money is a real thing that can drive real change. So give the money. I mean, that's great. You got to find what works for you. The third thing real quick is I know that there's some programs, probably not now, but maybe later, that allow people to go into the prisons. One that comes to mind is RISE, and it allows you to do a volunteer day in a prison. And the more that we can, there's big walls and barbed wire fences around prisons for a reason. They don't want you to see what's going on inside. So if you can get a glimpse inside, I think it it kind of challenges you to push back on the status quo.
Thank you again. Let's close with a prayer. The Lord be with you. Dear God, you are creator of all. You are merciful beyond measure, and you call us to join in your mercy and to love all people as our neighbors. Bring us to know and to work for your justice in the world, and guide the whole human family to walk in your way of peace. Fill our hearts with your mercy and forgiveness for our own failings and for the failings of others, and give us courage and wisdom to speak the truth in love, knowing that we can trust in you always. Amen.